Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in again. This is Reading Time with Pickle. As we have been for the last month or so, we are reading the supernatural mystery slash thriller slash suspense young adult novel Asylum by Miss Madeleine Roux. Um, we're getting to the real meat and potatoes of the novel. Um, the team, the Hydra, Dan, Jordan, and Abby, the three inseparable friends, have all seemingly have all gone their different ways. After the second time into the basement, they just kind of all drifted apart. Jordan's insecurities started coming to light, especially after Abby and Dan had their little quote unquote date. Um, Abby becomes increasingly fixated on the photograph of the little girl who it turns out to, or who Abby thinks is her aunt. And Abby starts drawing these very scary pictures inspired by her aunt, or really the little girl in the photograph. Jordan has become increasingly reclusive, but he did share that he's been having nightmares about shock therapy after their second basement visit. Dan's kind of stuck in a limbo where he likes Abby, but he does agree with Jordan that Abby might be a little bit too fixated on the girl. So they just all kind of stop getting along, drift apart. Dan's been getting these very mysterious memos or little envelopes with messages on them. The first was left on his desk, I believe, while he was out, and it says, "How do you kill a Hydra? You stab the heart," or something along those lines. And the second one, and this is what we're getting to in this upcoming chapter, was something along the lines of, a second, let me find it here. Insanity is relative. It depends on who has who locked in what cage. And this second memo really gets to Dan, because this guy's just, whoever it is that's writing these memos, Dan feels is just mocking him or messing with him. And it is this rather second memo that prompts Dan once again to visit the basement. I have voiced some opinions about this novel over the various videos that I've had. Number one, character development is weak. Jordan is a great character, or the strongest character, rather. And I'll get back to Jordan a bit later. Abby is a weak character. She's the only reason Dan was initially interested in her was because she was cute. That's all. That's all. And she has not the greatest family life. Her parents are on the brink of getting a divorce. Other than that, all Abby has shown us is her fixation on this girl whose photograph she found. That's it. That's Abby. I want to learn more about this girl. I think this girl is my aunt. That's it. In my opinion, she is a shallow character. She could be a lot stronger at this point in the novel. Dan is, I think, equally as shallow. Basically, he arrives at Brookline, the dorms, finds a photograph of a warden, becomes intrigued, wants to learn more about it, but that's all there is to Dan's personality. Really, he likes Abby and he wants to learn about the warden, or Dennis Hainline. What's his motivation? Other than because he's curious, that's not good enough to me. There has to be something stronger. Dan is here to learn and to study. And why is he getting wrapped up in all of this? Because he's curious? Have we had any examples before of him showing this kind of behavior? No. It's it's a weak foundation, in my opinion. Abby as well. What is Abby's motivation? Sure, her aunt, coincidentally, conveniently, her aunt was a patient at the asylum, and maybe that's why she is so fixated on this. But Abby has no connection to her aunt. They've never met ever, and it's kind of a situation where, like, oh yeah, my aunt, who I don't know, goes here, or was a patient here, and that's interesting to me. If I were in that position, that would be interesting. But their behavior, both Dan and Abby's behavior, is extreme for their motivation, or for the motivation that's driving them. And I find that a bit hard to believe. I do believe it makes their characters a bit one-dimensional. On the other hand, Jordan. Now, Jordan has no motivation, and it shows. He does not want to go to the basement. He sees no reason to risk getting kicked out of college prep to investigate this. Great. His motivation is to study, and he shows that. Furthermore, his insecurities are presented so well. Early on in the novel, he mentions something about he's insecure because his best friend from school suddenly stopped just talking to him, just ghosted on him after Jordan came out, which sucks. And I can see how he would carry that kind of insecurity. He was betrayed by his best friend, someone who he thought was close to him and who he could trust, just betrayed him, stopped talking to him. And it shows in how he reacts when Abby and Dan start hanging out together, when they have a date. And it shows in his dialogue. Basically, they're talking about something that has nothing to do with Jordan, but Jordan sort of twists this and internalizes it and gets offended and makes himself almost feel left out. And I think that's fantastic. Jordan has no motivation, but he has the strongest characterization in the novel. What I'm hoping for in the chapters going forward, and I know I'm talking a lot, we're about halfway through chapter 20. We're about halfway through the novel on chapter 20. What I'm hoping for is a bit more characterization with Dan and Abby. I don't think I'm going to get it at this point. If I haven't gotten it yet, I don't think it's coming. We can hope. What I also hope for is there to be some progress in the actual story. So far, really, there's no story, and that's been boring, and I've almost given up on this novel. It's basically, let's learn about the asylum. Let's go to the basement. Oh, we found something interesting. Oh, I've gotten a spooky email, or I've had a mysterious note left on. Nothing has happened. Something's got to happen. And that's what I'm hoping going forward. So let's just dive right in. I know I've been droning on and on. Chapter number 20. Dan knew it was not his best idea sneaking into the basement by himself. To start with, the door would be locked. One of the hall monitors might be standing guard, but he wasn't going to overthink this. Thinking hadn't gotten him anywhere. Out in the hall, the lights were too bright. He longed for the cover of total darkness. At least nobody was around. They were probably all at dinner or out doing their own thing, like Felix. Still, Dan didn't want to get careless. He sneaked over to where the vending machines were and was about to turn the corner to the warden's office when he saw a dark silhouette appear at the end of the hall. Footsteps, voices. For a terrifying instant, thoughts of the sculptor or another of Brookline's killers returning to stalk the halls made his body tighten up all over. He pressed himself against the wall, hoping he would blend into the shadows. They should just trade him and do everyone a favor, said a male voice. Dan let out his breath, not even aware he'd been holding it. It wasn't a ghost, it was Joe. Whatever, man. Dan didn't recognize the second voice. Probably another hall monitor. Were they patrolling the halls, making sure no one went down to the basement? Dan stood there for what felt like forever, until finally he saw Joe and his buddy go out the front door. He waited a minute or two just to be safe, and then turned the corner to the old wing. Luck was on his side. The heavy door was not only unguarded, it was unlocked. Probably Joe hadn't snapped the padlock shut all the way the other night. Dan convinced himself. Probably Joe hadn't snapped the padlock shut all the way the other night, Dan convinced himself. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that the door was ready and waiting for him. Dan slipped inside, and the stale air wrapped itself around him like a welcome. He hadn't forgotten how dark it was down here. He clicked on his flashlight, but without anyone to break the silence, the darkness was exceptionally scarier. Dan plunged through the reception room and into the outer office, the one with the scratched-off letters on the glass. He retraced their steps from last time, pausing to check that the photos were still stacked neatly on the desk. From its frame on the wall, the photo of the struggling patient seemed to be taunting him. The sculptor, patient 361. Dan crouched behind the file cabinet and climbed through the secret passage. Without hesitating, he pointed his flashlight at the stairwell and hurried down, knowing that if he waited, he might lose the courage and turn back. The lower hall was still a mess. He cautiously navigated the chairs and gurneys. The last thing he needed was to break his neck tripping over a piece of furniture. It would be a while before anyone found his body. Dan moved past the empty cells. It felt like something might jump out of every one. He moved quickly now, anxious to get to the pristine inner office. Apart from his thumping heartbeat and quick breaths, the hallway was eerily silent. Steps away from the rotunda room and the office beyond, his foot collided with something small but heavy. It rolled noisily away into the darkness, and Dan focused his light on the floor, following the little trail whatever it was had left through the dust. Crossed the floor and into one of the open cells. In the middle of the room, Dan reached up and risked pulling the old string attached to the ceiling light. A single naked bulb clicked on, buzzing and flickering for a moment before bathing the cell in a faint yellow glow. It was barely enough to see by, but it was better than his flashlight. Dan looked around. This was one of the many cells he and Abby hadn't explored. There was a table and a bed, but nothing else. He squinted, turning in a complete circle. What had he kicked, and where had it gone? Then, a soft, high-pitched chime started up from under the bed. Dan stumbled toward the sound as whatever it was crackled faintly and began to sing. No, not sing, play music. Dan crouched, the hairs on his forearms standing up as the broken off-key tune of the music box filled the room. He didn't recognize the melody. It sounded so old he wasn't sure anyone alive would. Dan fished under the bed until his fingers ran over the rigid metal surface of the box. He nudged it out carefully, then picked it up to examine. There were 2 broken springs sticking out on either side. Standing on top was a little porcelain figurine, a ballerina. She was in a dancer's pose, her arms curved gracefully above her head. Her fingers ended in dangerously sharp points, and the look on her face was eerily smug, as if she were relishing a secret. Dan listened to the painful crawl of the song as the notes wound down, the mechanical tune dying dying a lingering death. Finally it stopped, and the room fell silent once more. He tipped the box over and found an inscription etched into the bottom. To Lucy, on your birthday, with love. Dan stared at the words for a long time, hoping maybe if he just waited they'd change or disappear. This couldn't be the same Lucy, could it? Abby's Lucy? If Abby's story had been true, it didn't seem like Lucy's parents would have been the type to send a birthday present. Maybe it was a gift from the warden himself. Either way, what was it doing down here? Did it mean that Lucy had died or just left it behind? Dan kept worrying the question like a sore tooth. One thing he knew for sure. He would not be sharing this discovery with Abby. She would go out of her mind worrying about what it meant. He set the box back down on the floor and turned to leave the cell behind him. But suddenly, the disjointed song started up again, getting louder and clearer and faster as it played. Dan thought about smashing the box to stop it, but he chose to flee instead. That box had meant something to someone, once. Dan continued down the hall, coming to the rotunda off which he and Abby had found the inner office. This time he took full stock of the space, shining his flashlight all along the wall and finding a small doorway across from the office. He took hold of the knob and turned. The door wasn't locked, but it didn't budge either. It had swollen shut in the dampness and gloom. Putting all his weight behind it, Dan turned and pushed as hard as he could. The door shrieked a protest, but open it did, and Dan only just caught himself from a nasty fall. Lowering before him was another set of stairs. So just one comment before we head into chapter 21. I'm tired of going to the basement. This is the third time. That is one time too much. This, at this point, is boring. I know what the basement is like. We've been here twice before. It's not engaging. It's no longer interesting. What should have happened is the first time they go into the sealed off section, they should have went to the basement. And at that time, they should have been caught as a group. And that kind of sets the tone that, oh, these three are kind of troublemakers. And the second time, they need to revisit later on in the novel, and it would be kind of like a throwback to the beginning of the novel, but more. Just going back to the basement, every 6 chapters? Like, come on. Okay, let's continue. Chapter number 21. Dan was looking into a yawning void. How far under the earth did this place go, anyway? The cold rushing up from the space below was shocking. His sweatshirt wasn't close to being warm enough. He should have brought a damn parka. And couldn't they have built the stairs a little wider? A safety inspector would have a heart attack. These stairs were steep, narrow, and had a sheer drop on both sides with only a tiny pole of railing to hold on to. Clutching the rail in one hand and his flashlight in the other, Dan took the first step. 3 stairs, 4, 10. After 15 steps, he reached a small landing. But he couldn't see the floor with his flashlight. Just more and more stairs, pitched at a nightmarish incline leading into the bowels of the basement. 1 more landing, 12 more steps, and at last he reached the bottom. He shined his flashlight up and around, watching as the meager light failed to find the top or even sides of a cave, a vault? He couldn't be sure, but he could tell it was enormous. Coughing, he listened to the sound bounce and echo for a solid minute before finally fading away. He slowly walked forward into the huge space. There were wooden posts that ran from the floor to the ceiling. Otherwise, the hall he was in seemed completely empty. Finally, he reached a square arch leading into yet another space beyond. Dan suddenly felt like laughing. He'd been creeped out by the expansiveness of the cell level and the warden's secret office, but this was something else, something he could hardly fathom, even as his eyes fed him the information. It was like a palace down here. What could it have been used for? But this was the last room. It had to be. Shining his light all around, he found a rusted metal box screwed into the wall beside him, and he carefully nudged open the front panel. The rusty hinges squealed, and the echoes in the chambers reverberated endlessly. He'd hit the jackpot. There were switches in the box, and lots of them. Dan flicked the biggest one and was rewarded with a low hum, then a buzz, and finally a quiet pop as the lights came up. Only a few worked, and one exploded overhead in a shower of glass and sparks. Dan ducked instinctively and then gasped. He was looking down into an operating amphitheater. In the very middle of the room was a raised wooden platform, and standing dead center was an operating table. It was covered with a smooth sheet, originally white, now gray with dust. There was a padded pillow at the top. Leather straps buckled, trisected the bed. Around the main table stood a few smaller tables on wheels. They had surgical instruments on them. Encircling the platform were stepped rows of chairs, like in a sports arena, stands, as if watching someone's surgery was some kind of amusement. With a sickening lurch, Dan realized he'd seen this room before, too, in another nightmare. In his dream, he'd started out on that table. He moved slowly down the stands, drawn to the platform. He walked a complete circle around it, his eyes never leaving the table. How many killers had been treated here? Had little Lucy been strapped down for surgery while people watched? Dan thought of the scar on her forehead that suggested a lobotomy. If it hadn't been that, and she had survived, poor little Lucy wouldn't have had much of a life. Why on earth would an operating amphitheater be built so far underground? Were they concealing something? A small desk and filing cabinet at the very back of the room caught Dan's eye. They'd both been pushed into the shadows as if they wanted to be overlooked. Dan's heart raced. If patients were operated on here, if Lucy Valdez had been operated on, there would surely be records of it. If he was lucky, those records might not have gotten lost in the shuffle when Brookline closed. But as he approached the cabinets, his head felt slightly heavy, like he'd been stuffed with wool. He blinked once, twice. The floor didn't feel so sturdy anymore. He stood over the table, ready, confident. This was his moment. He had an audience, and he would not disappoint them. This was his chance to prove that his methods, however unorthodox, worked. He was the warden. He was the trusted father of the Brookline family, strict but ultimately fair. Daniel looked down at his clean white coat and the instruments in his hand, sanitized and gleaming. Everything was prepared. Necks craned as each man tried to get a better look. Before him, strapped to the operating table, was a young boy who liked to set fires. When Daniel blinked, it was someone new, someone else who needed fixing. A cruel widow who had poisoned 6 husbands. A pretty young girl with fiery red hair. Blinking again, he found the most wretched creature of all. He looked at the man's waxy face, slack now from the sedatives. The man was broken, but he wouldn't be broken for long. He could be fixed. They could all be fixed. Dan, the warden, started. Sudden sounds. A pounding like thunder, footsteps overhead. His vision blurred, spinning out of control. Not now. They couldn't come for him now. The authorities would never understand what he was trying to do. Dan, Dan. They were calling his name now. They were coming for him. Dan, hello? Dan, are you all right? You're scaring me. Snap out of it. Snap. Dan was cold all over and realized with a jolt that he was lying on the floor. Abby's face materialized above him through the fading blur of the vision. For a moment he was relieved, but then he felt instantly ashamed. What would she think if she could see inside his head? We'll end this episode right here. Um, we're learning a bit more about Dan's history and his connection with Brookline. And not those Shine My Own Boots, but this was actually something that I had predicted in the very last video, so check that one out. Daniel was/is the warden. Now, who knows what might have happened and why he is now a child and why he has these memories. I guess that is yet to be seen. I still want to learn more about Abby's connection. I'm sure Abby has a similar thing that Dan has going on, where she has some type of connection to Lucy Valdez. I still have no idea about Jordan or about Felix. I'm sure Felix will play an important part later on. But we'll end this chapter here. Thank you as always for joining Reading Time with Pickle.